So we're doing the message just a little bit different this morning. Mary Dan and I thought that it might be appropriate, since we're starting the new year, kind of starting the new leadership team, that we kind of shared the message together. In theory, each half is supposed to be about 10 minutes or so. Given that I've probably never given a sermon less than 20 minutes, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge, but I'm going to do my best here. So we're just going to jump right into it. And first, a little bit of audience participation. By a show of hands, who here has heard of this underdog story from the Bible? It's found in 1 Samuel, and it's commonly referred to as David and Goliath. Show of hands, who's heard of that? Everyone? I pretty much expected a unanimous response. You don't have to be a biblical scholar to know this story. Even those who have hardly cracked the Bible are likely to be familiar with the basic story plot of David versus Goliath. Let's just review a few facts, though, from the story. Goliath is a Philistine giant, literally a giant. Reports are that he was either 6'9" or 9'9", but the most recent biblical historians think he's probably 6'9", which seems a little bit more realistic, but that's still pretty big. And he was big in every dimension, literally a giant. Medical historians now think that he probably had a medical condition that we call acromegaly, which is a pituitary tumor that's putting out too much growth hormone. Does anyone here know who Andre the Giant is? So back in the Hulk Hogan WWF days, and if you've seen a movie called Princess Bride, which is one of my favorites, that's Hulk Hogan. So if you can know what Colin, you guys know not Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, right? Picture Andre the Giant. That's how big this guy is. Huge. And Andre the Giant has acromegaly, by the way.
And ugly.
Well, not only is he huge, he is well-trained in hand-to-hand combat. He is the Philistine army's star warrior. He's defeated every other star warrior he's come up against. He's wearing about 100 pounds of armor. He has a spear that would be too heavy for most of the other soldiers to even wield in battle. And he is undefeated in one-on-one duels with other trained warriors. None of the Hebrew soldiers are brave enough, or you might say stupid enough, to volunteer to fight him. David, on the other hand, is described as a shepherd boy. He's probably in his teens. He's described as a shepherd boy. He has no formal military training. He is not a warrior. The only reason he's even at the battlefront is that he was sent by his father to send his brothers who are in the Hebrew army with food and to report back to his father how they're doing. That's the only reason he's even there. So when David volunteers to fight Goliath, King Saul first tries to talk him out of it, and his brothers basically ridicule him. And why not? On first glance, this seems a very lopsided match. Actually, even on second glance, it seems like a very lopsided match. And the stakes were very high. Not only did it seem David was very likely to lose his life in the duel, the loser's army would become enslaved to the winner's armies. To the winner's army. Those were the stakes, high stakes. David and Goliath is probably considered the original underdog story. In fact, the phrase David versus Goliath has come to represent in modern language the underdog versus the favorite, or to describe facing something against long odds. So how did we know how the story ends? How did the shepherd boy David possibly defeat the much larger and more experienced warrior Goliath? David decided to use what he was good at. He decided not to wear battle armor and wield a sword in hand-to-hand combat against the much larger, stronger, and more heavily armed Goliath. Those were the terms of the battle that Goliath expected the fight to be based on. No, David refused King Saul's offer to use his armor and walked out to the battlefield to face the giant. On the way, he picked up 5 smooth stones and placed the first one in his sling. It only took 1 stone. David wisely decided to use what he was good at, what he knew. He was what was termed a slinger. He had spent hours practicing. It was how he protected his flock. He told King Saul that he had defeated lions and bears due to his skill with his weapon, a sling and a stone. David was sure that with God's help, that he would defeat this giant. After Goliath insults and mocks him on the battlefield confrontation, David shouts to Goliath, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." In just a few seconds later, following a dead-eye shot to Goliath's forehead, that is exactly what had happened. During our road trip out and back from Yellowstone and the Tetons last summer, Stacy and I listened to a book on tape titled David and Goliath. And the subtitle is Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. This book on tape was really interesting to me. It was quite an eye-opener, and it has caused me to reevaluate how I think about many things, including what I perceive as advantages versus disadvantages. I'm actually in the process of listening to it all the way through for the second time now. And it really was the inspiration for this message. Now, I'm trying to summarize 6 CDs and 7 hours of material into what is supposed to be a 10-minute message. A difficult proposition, especially for me. If anyone ever wants to borrow it, you're more than welcome to. But I would like it back, because I'm sure I'll be listening to it from time to time. It's really good. The author uses many, and did I give the author? I left it down there. Its last name is Malcolm. What's it say, Sherry? I meant to bring it up with me.
Malcolm Gladwell.
Malcolm Gladwell. I should give him notice since I'm going to summarize a lot of what he has in him. Malcolm Gladwell. So, Mr. Gladwell uses multiple examples to challenge our conventional views on how we look at advantages versus disadvantages. His first example, of course, was the David and Goliath story. His main point is that we tend to think of this story in the wrong way. How do we think of it? We think of it as the classic underdog story. But he argues that if you really look at the battle, how it unfolded itself, David should have won. Because David was wise enough to change the rules of engagement from what Goliath expected, a close quarters combat to the death, Goliath's strength, to a longer range combat, David's strength. David was essentially the special forces sniper of his era. He did not try to fight a duel on the giant's terms. He fought it on his terms. Once this decision was made by David, Goliath really became the underdog at that point. Through multiple other examples, Mr. Gladwell illustrates that what we often consider to be an advantage can be a disadvantage. Goliath was very big and strong, but slow, and also related to his probably acromegaly and a pituitary tumor, not very good vision. He couldn't tell that David had changed the rules of engagement until it was too late. And what we consider to be a disadvantage can be an advantage. Here are just a couple of the many examples the author used to make this point. Many of the very highest accomplished professionals, world-famous lawyers, Fortune 500 company CEOs, multimillionaire entrepreneurs. A surprising number of them are dyslexic. Their early struggles with reading and traditional schoolwork led them to develop other talents and other ways of learning and thinking that later served them very well in their chosen professions. And key is that each of those individuals wisely chose their professions based on their strengths, not their weaknesses. Another example, a disproportionate number of world leaders through the last couple of centuries, presidents, chancellors, prime ministers, a surprising number of them, too many to be considered a coincidence, lost a parent in childhood. Now, would you wish dyslexia on one of your children? Probably not. Would you choose to lose a parent in childhood? Definitely not. But for a select group of people, these difficult and even painful experiences can bring out talents and a different way of doing things that leads them to be very successful. There is actually a name that scholars have come up for this. It's called the theory of desirable difficulty. I'm going to repeat that because those last two words would seem opposed. It's the theory of desirable difficulty. The Apostle Paul knew this theory very well. Oh, I'm sure he didn't call it by this name, the theory of desirable difficulty, but he knew it well because he lived it. A good example is from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. And I'm quoting the Apostle Paul. I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So is there a point to all of this that perhaps the Branson Community of Christ congregation can learn from? Perhaps even take heart from? Well, I think there is. Do me a favor. I'm going to pause for about 10 seconds and give you 2 questions to consider. Answer these at least in your head. First question. As a church, Community of Christ church congregation, what do you consider our greatest disadvantage? Get that in your head. As a church, second question, as a Community of Christ church congregation, what do you consider our greatest advantage? Now, you can just answer in your head. If anyone's bold enough to raise their hand, that's fine too. But for the first question, what is our congregation's greatest disadvantage? I'm curious, did any of you answer our small size? A lot of hands over here. Yeah. Anyone over here? That probably would have been my answer. For the second question, what is our congregation's greatest advantage? Did any of you answer our congregation's small size? Mm-hmm. You did both, Tanner?
Yes, I did.
That's actually where I'm going here, Tanner. My bet was that there'd be several that thought that for our disadvantage, and not many that thought that for advantage. But Mr. Gladwell would challenge that. And I want to challenge it now a little bit too. But I think we, and me included, so I'm not picking on any of you out there, tend to sometimes, okay, even much of the time, think of our smaller congregational size as a disadvantage. And it certainly can present its challenges. We don't have a church choir. We don't have a pianist. We don't have paid ministers, so we lay ministers here add these responsibilities at church to our jobs, our family lives, and our other obligations and activities. If something's going to be done, this group here pretty much has to do it. It can, as bad as it sounds, seem like a little bit of a burden at times. And it is pretty much impossible to just slip in the back of the church service and not be noticed. But there are also advantages that maybe we don't consider enough to being a smaller congregation led by lay ministers. I think it can often be easier to create a ministry environment in which the Spirit is readily felt, because we have a more intimate and a cozier, if you will, group. We know each other pretty well. We kind of know what's going on in each other's lives. It's easier for us to minister to each other than just, oh, hey, how you doing, the cursory that someone you don't know that well in a bigger congregation. When we were at Olathe congregation, we'd probably been there 3 years and people introducing themselves, and we were on the priesthood. So there can be some, we know each other better. If you have, we also have the potential to be more flexible. If you have an idea, you don't have to go through some large bureaucracy to have it considered. We are right here, the leadership. You might even end up finding yourself in charge of the new idea. Mm-hmm. We get to benefit from being more directly involved in the services, not just passive participants. You want a job? Chances are we have a need right now that will fit your gifts and abilities. And I think that fits very well into today's theme of what gifts do you bring? And the last advantage, it's pretty much impossible to just slip into the back of the church service, I noticed. See what I did there? I'm going to close, and I did say close, with Samuel 16:7. Now this is a little different part of Samuel than the David and Goliath story. So this is God's instruction to the prophet Samuel when he directed him to go to Bethlehem to choose King Saul's successor, the next king of Israel. God's instructions to Samuel: do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. God was referring to one of David's brothers, Eliab, who was older than David, larger in stature, and more impressive in sight than David. He goes on to say to Samuel, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. People look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. I think our first tendency when we look at our relatively small size is to look at it as a disadvantage, but with the proper effort and motivation, and most importantly, with the correct spirit and heart, God can help us and help this congregation use it as an advantage to what should be our ultimate goal, and that is to be God's facilitator. I'm going to close this part of the message with a statement that you have likely heard before. It is not our job to save people. That is Jesus' job. Our job is to introduce them.